I'm here today to tell you more about some of my experiences with demonstrating open source value, along with some resources that we've developed within the CHAOSS project that can help you with this rather complex topic. So, for me, the CHAOSS project is not just about metrics, but about how we use metrics in our day-to-day open source work to make projects healthier, more sustainable, more viable. I've spent the past 25 years helping companies think strategically about using and contributing to open source software. And a big part of doing that has been using data and metrics to justify or demonstrate the value of various open source efforts. I've done this within companies like Intel and VMware, and I've done this on a volunteer basis for organizations like the CNCF when I was co-chair for their contributor strategy technical advisory group and their governance working group. And I've probably worked with, I don't know, close to 100 open source projects over the years, but the focus has never been on the metrics alone, but with thinking strategically about how to use what we learn from the metrics to improve our work in open source. So this is why this presentation is less focused on the metrics and more focused on how we can use metrics as part of how we demonstrate the value of our open source efforts. Now, a little caveat, because most of my work has been in corporate environments, that's the context that I'll talk about the most, but I will also talk about where demonstrating value is different in a university context. So I will start today with a very brief overview of the CHAOSS project as a whole, before moving on to talk about how demonstrating the organizational value of your open source efforts relies on goal alignment, which includes aligning your open source work with the broader goals of your organization. And then we'll move on to prioritization of efforts by looking at the project criticality together with project health risk. And finally, I'll talk about framing the value of your work in a way that resonates with your leadership team and with your funders. And then after the presentation, we'll have some more time for discussion about how to demonstrate value in a university context. Now, for those of you who are new to CHAOSS, CHAOSS stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. I'm guessing that most of you know about CHAOSS, but I also suspect that some of you maybe think we just define metrics and create software to collect those metrics, which we absolutely do. But we've also expanded our focus over the past few years into some other areas. We've realized that people sometimes struggle with this tsunami of metrics that are available on metrics dashboards. So we've started spending more time helping people figure out how to use metrics to drive decisions related to their specific context. We have active working groups on a variety of things, and which you can see on the slide. And we've realized, in particular, we have an OSPO working group that might be interesting for you, and a funding impact measurement working group where we talk about funding for open source projects. And some of you might also be interested in the scientific and research software working group or the UN SDGs working group. And we also have chapters focused on CHAOSS in Africa and Asia. And of course, we have software to help people gather and analyze metrics about open source projects. If you're looking for ways to get more involved in CHAOSS, here are just a few suggestions. Everyone is welcome to attend any of our meetings or join any of our Slack channels to get involved in our groups, chapters, initiatives, or software projects. A good place to get started is to join one of our newcomer hangouts where you can ask questions and have someone help you get started. We also recommend joining our weekly CHAOSS community call on Tuesday, where you can learn about what we're working on. Or you can pick any of our working groups or chapters and drop into those meetings or their Slack channels. The link at the bottom of the slide will take you to a page with more information and links to the CHAOSS calendar where you can find all of our meetings. We also have several areas within the CHAOSS project that are always looking for contributors. Our education project is a great place to contribute, even if you're new to CHAOSS. The CHAOSS DEI Badging Initiative allows events and projects to apply for one of our badges. And these badges are really popular, especially for events. So we're always looking for badgers to review these applications. And finally, as with most open source projects, we have software. So we're always looking for people who want to provide feedback as users maybe file issues when something goes wrong, improve our documentation, or contribute directly to the software. And I've linked all of these to web pages where you can learn more, and I'll share the slides with you all after the presentation. Now, we've also recently launched a practitioner guide series. And we're always looking for people to contribute new guides, provide feedback on guides, and even suggest new guides that you'd like to see someone else create. So each guide is focused on a single topic, but the real value of these guides isn't actually in the metrics, but in how to make meaningful improvements to your work in open source across several key areas. So if you're looking for additional ideas for improving your projects, these guides are a good place to start. We have guides on improving contributor sustainability, organizational participation, assessing viability, research software impact, and there's one more that's not on the slide, the funding impact measurement guide, because I just published it before coming to this meeting. And also one of our guides is all about demonstrating the value of your open source efforts within your organization, which is what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation today. Demonstrating organizational value is one of our most ambitious practitioner guides, and it's pretty different from some of the other guides in the series. Most of our guides were designed as getting started guides to help people make quick progress on a topic that maybe they didn't have much experience with. And as many of you know, demonstrating the value of your open source efforts can be a real challenge for many OSPOs and other open source teams to justify the value of this work to your leadership and your outside funders so that the open source work can continue over the long periods of time needed to sustain open source projects. Open source teams often default to justifying their work by talking about contributions to open source in ways that sound an awful lot like charity, by talking about how it's for the good of the community, which doesn't always resonate with leadership. In other cases, open source teams provide an overview of the work done in an open source project using numbers of contributions, maintainers, numbers of commits. However, what this indicates to leadership is that people are spending effort, but there still isn't a demonstrated understanding of the return on that time that employees are spending on open source efforts. So first, let's talk about this from an organizational perspective. So justifying the work within your university. The best way to demonstrate the value of your open source efforts is by showing how the work helps your organization achieve its goals. The leadership team has to look across the whole organization, the whole university, and prioritize efforts that have the biggest overall impact as a whole on the organization. And this means that if you want your leadership to continue to staff and fund your OSPO or other open source teams, you need to be able to make the case for why your work is as important or more important than other efforts that are also competing for limited resources. Having a clear open source strategy where you can tell the story of how your open source work achieves the organization's goals is the best way for leadership to understand the importance of the work so that you can continue doing it. When I worked at Pivotal, I was responsible for our open source strategy, and Kubernetes was a big part of that strategy. So this was before the VMware acquisition of Pivotal. And we were in the process of making the shift from using Cloud Foundry as the base for our main products to using Kubernetes. Now, this was a huge shift for the company. Pivotal was one of the creators of Cloud Foundry, and we had a ton of influence in that project while we were just getting started with Kubernetes. I spent quite a bit of time talking to our CTO who was driving this shift, along with the people responsible for driving the individual product strategies, with a focus on where we wanted to be in a few years. I also started engaging within the Kubernetes community to explore different aspects of Kubernetes while talking to our engineers about the strengths and weaknesses of various areas within Kubernetes so that we could match up what we were going to need in the next few years with the areas within Kubernetes that would need work if we wanted to base our products on top of it. Now, we used all of this information to create a written strategy that clearly tied our open source Kubernetes work back to our overall company mission and goals. And I was able to get people allocated to upstream Kubernetes by showing how our long-term product strategies relied on specific areas within the Kubernetes code base and outlining where we needed to make contributions to support those products. We then continued to track those contributions so we could show the value that we were providing back to the company. Now, where this is different in a university context is that you also need to justify value to funders. Now, as we all know, the Sloan Foundation has funded CHAOSS and quite a few university OSPOs. And other open source work within universities is often funded by a variety of outside funders rather than internal university funds. And in this case, you need to be able to demonstrate the value of your OSPO to the people who have already provided funding, but also demonstrate the value to future funders. And in many cases, this is similar to the corporate context. You need to understand the goals of the particular funder and make sure that the work you're proposing is aligning with the funder's goals and fits within their grant-making strategies or their open calls. And this is probably in addition to justifying the work within your university. The Demonstrating Value Practitioner Guide has a framework that can help you think about how to demonstrate the value of your work using a rough formula that uses criticality and project health risk to help you prioritize your open source efforts. Now, the first step is to determine criticality, which is the key to defining the importance of a project to your organization and aligning with your overall goals, because critical projects can be used to frame an OSPO's strategy in a way that leadership will understand how important it is to continue this work over the long term to ensure that the organization can achieve its goals. And you can start by looking at how your organization depends on particular projects. Now, just an additional note to avoid confusion, when I talk about criticality, it refers to how critical something is within a specific organization. And this is unique to each organization. So this is very different from the OpenSSF's criticality score, which tries to define the influence and importance of a project within the broader ecosystem of open source software, but it doesn't tell us anything about how important a project is to your specific university or your efforts. Now, I've seen a lot of people struggle with the difference between projects that are frequently used, which is more a question of scale, versus the projects that are truly strategic. And the way I like to think about this is by asking whether I could easily drop in a replacement. So you might use a tiny library in a bunch of places to make some task quicker, easier. But if you could easily replace it with something else, like another similar library, or you could rewrite it yourself pretty easily, then it's not likely to be a critical project for your organization. Now, something like Kubernetes, on the other hand, is an incredibly complex piece of software that could not be easily replaced. And if you're relying on it to perform some important activity, this would be a critical project for you. When I was at VMware, I was responsible for maintaining our list of strategic projects. And this came about because executives would ask which open source projects were most important. And our compliance team would dutifully send them the list of packages that appeared most frequently in our products. But this wasn't what leadership cared about. They wanted to know which open source projects were the most critical or most strategic for us. We generated this strategic projects list by talking to the product folks in our business units to ask them what open source projects they relied on and couldn't deliver without them. And it provided a window for executives into what projects were most important and most strategic, while also helping our business units coordinate with each other when they were engaging in the same projects. And it provided a way to justify having people contributing to those projects. Now, when thinking about which projects are most critical in a corporate setting, we often focus on how those projects impact a company's ability to deliver products and services to their customers. Now, the concept of criticality still applies to the university setting, but in very different ways. So one area to look at is research software impact. And we even have a CHAOSS practitioner guide on this topic that was developed by our own Claire, along with Matt German-Prey, along with others from the CHAOSS community in the university working group that we had for a while. Now, understanding the importance of open source software's role in delivering educational outcomes is another element of determining criticality in universities. OSPOs are also approached by faculty who need support for developing funding applications when open source software is part of that application. And I'm sure there are loads of other areas that are important for determining the importance of your OSPO within your university, but we'll save some of that discussion for the end as well. Now, some open source projects are healthier and more sustainable than others. A healthy open source project that is critical to your organization is still likely to be a lower priority than maybe an equally critical but more risky project that maybe needs some help to become healthy. And by working to improve project health, you can reduce the risk of using it by allocating resources to improve the project to bring it into a healthier state. And there are plenty of metrics you can use to think about project health risk, things like code base quality, responsiveness, organizational diversity, roadmaps, documentation, security. Those are all good places to start. The priority for investment from your organization is a combination of criticality and project health risk. And that combination is unique to your organization. Every organization has slightly different goals and needs, even within universities. And you need to allocate staff to the areas that are of the highest priority for your organization. And you need to use your limited resources wisely in a way that can be justified to your leadership and your funders as part of helping achieve your goals. And by defining the highest priority projects, you can justify the work by showing how the work on those projects helps you achieve your goals. Now, this slide just helps summarize how criticality and project health risk come together to help you set priorities and make the best use out of limited resources that are available to you. Assessing criticality starts with looking at how much you depend on a project, along with the opportunities available to you from participating. You also need to consider how the project aligns with your organization's goals. The other half of the equation assesses project health risk to help you understand the risks that you might be taking by using this project, along with looking at how you might be able to engage in the project to help it become more sustainable. And then both of these come together to help you set your priorities so that you're using your limited resources on the projects that will have the biggest impact toward helping you achieve your goals. Now, after identifying the critical projects and prioritizing them to work on the ones that generate the most value for your organization, you still need to be able to communicate how your work is helping to achieve the organization's and the funder's goals. Now, too often, OSPOs default to measuring the things that are easy to count rather than the activities that have the most value. So you need to make sure that your communications to leadership and your funders stay laser focused on the value of the work. It can help to think about whether the features you need are complete and stable, whether the issues you're concerned about are being addressed, and whether the projects you rely on are healthy and sustainable. The Demonstrating Value Guide has more detailed examples of how to do this, but it comes down to being able to measure what matters and then use that data to tell a story about the value of your work. Now, every organization and every funder has unique needs and unique goals based on what you're trying to achieve. So there is no one-size-fits-all way of demonstrating value. The framework in this practitioner guide uses criticality and project health risk to set your priorities, which is one way to think about demonstrating value, but there are certainly other ways. What's important is to understand how the open source work helps your organization achieve its goals and be able to frame the value in ways that resonate with your leadership and your funders. Just a couple of quick thank yous before I open it up for questions and discussion. Of course, I want to thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for funding the CHAOSS Data Science Initiative for the past 3 years. I also want to thank Bob, since he was my co-author on the Demonstrating Value Practitioner Guide, and a lot of the content in the guide was based on his work when he was at Google.